Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dr. Duke Show. I am Dr. Duke, and I am joined today with one of my very favorite guests. We have chemistry, Vicki McKenna. we have conversational chemistry, I think, and so thanks for being with us.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
So this is a show that's actually dear to my heart. To me, we spend a lot of time talking about the bad books that progressives are putting in school. And we should spend a lot of time talking about that because a lot of it is pornographic and inappropriate and just wildly not the kind of thing we should put in front of our kids. However, what we're not talking about enough, Vicki, which is why we're going to do it today, is what our kids are not reading. And that's the thing. Even if you put really bad books in front of these kids, but you balanced it out by having them read the classics, there's a fighting chance that these kids may grow up not mindlessly progressive. But besides poisoning our kids' minds with bad and pornographic books, now we're removing good ones. We have this story out of the United Kingdom. England, of all places, a counter-terrorist organization, governmental in the UK, has now decided that Shakespeare and Orwell's 1984, Milton and Chaucer, the great writers of Christian culture in the West, are now dangerously full of right-wing sympathies, and that they may lead people who read English literature, may lead them to alt-right dangerous positions.
This is almost too much to even think. You want to say this has to be parody, but it isn't. I mean, what's going to be the next step? Is the Bible too subversive? Are we going to have to, eliminate people's access to that, or change words in it or something? Look, you teach English literature to young people. You've seen their rejection of the concept of reading books. They don't want to read books. They want to, digest something someone told them, but as long as it doesn't make them uncomfortable at all, they're not being exposed to the mechanisms of literature that give you access to new synaptic connections in your brain that allow you to actually develop logic, not just logic and being shown Venn diagrams, but the logic of humanity, the logic of rights, human rights and morality. And that's what English literature does. That's what great books do. They don't just tell really interesting stories. I mean, if they were just about telling interesting stories, nobody would care that they were brilliantly written. They could be, schlocky and kind of, ungrammatical even. But the great books are beyond just great stories. They give you an ability, a new ability as a young person, as even an older person, to think differently. I mean, to think differently and to think differently permanently. I think what far right sympathies means to these people is independent thought or critical thought, or maybe understanding the logic of morality and human rights. And since the antithesis of that is the goal, it seems to be, of the new progressives and the new globalists, maybe that's what they're fearing, that it unlocks a box that you can't shut the lid once you open it. And it makes me sad, it makes me sick, and it makes me worry for Western civilization and the greatness of the culture of it.
I mean, it's not just what you just said there. It's not critical thinking and exposing them to great aesthetics and art. It is absolutely true, Vicki, that the art, aestheticism, the idea that something is not just philosophically or linguistic important, but it's also beautiful. It is a triumph in how it's crafted. Things like poetry and aesthetics. And our kids are completely not being taught that because those are quote unquote elitist. Those, if the only thing you read is the great artistic writers of American and English history, well, then you're not reading all of these idiots, Hannah Jones, right, with the 1690, Zendi, right? All of these parvenus, these new sociological writers whose books are ending up in the classroom, all these race baiters. There's nothing aesthetic or even philosophically deep about them. One thing I would add to what you said, but it's not just that. It's also the one thing that these books all have in common is they're part of the Christian tradition, number one, or in the case of Orwell, they are warning what happens when you reject that system. So on top of everything else, this is the de-Christianization of Western culture. And so you got to purge everybody from Beowulf all the way through George Orwell.
You have to purge the Bible at some point here.
Yes.
I mean, how far away are we from seeing somebody argue that the Bible is too politically incorrect and is transphobic, is anti-gay, is white supremacy? Seriously, it's a matter of time. They've done it with Martin Luther King Jr., so I can't see why they wouldn't ultimately go for the source of the things that we relied on, that the writers that you were talking about relied on to create these great works. And as you say, these great aesthetic works as well. You might as well just nip it in the bud and get it at the source. You mentioned something about aesthetics. And it's impossible not to notice this now, whether it's visual aesthetics or linguistic aesthetics, the rejection of symmetry and perfection, or at least attempts at perfection. Look what it has given us. Beauty has been inverted. Ugly is beautiful. There is no imagination in art any longer. You can read Ibram X. Kendi and you will be left thinking an AI program could have written this book. There's nothing human in it. The humanity's been beaten out of it, because when you essentially tell humanity that they're supposed to reject what they know is beautiful, invert that into ugliness, and then try to destroy it. When you've done that, you can't be an inspired person. You're not going to build a beautiful cathedral. You're going to build an ugly box and maybe paint it a boring color and decimate the landscape, the beautiful natural landscape, with ugly things like wind farms, and pretend that that's aesthetics. I mean, it is beyond just the books. It has infected everything that surrounds us. You look around and the beautiful things are being torn down and the beautiful words are being destroyed, and they're being replaced with text speak and ugly boxes and paintings that are meant to be hideous, and a reinvention and reconfiguration of the meaning of human beauty, and an inversion of that into ugliness. It's terrifying what's going on, and it began with books. It always began with books.
Well, the interesting thing is that you go back to the idea of the Bible. This is not coming; it's already come. 20 years ago, Vicky, right around the year 2000, they came out with a German version of the Gospels of the Bible, in which they changed the story. It was no longer Jesus Christ, the Son of God. They replaced it with Judith Christ, the daughter of God. All references to the male pronoun, all ideas of Jesus's maleness were completely removed, and he was transformed in this particular version of the Bible to Judith Christ, the daughter of God. And so there have been a lot of attempts.
Blasphemy now is substituting for the Gospels. I mean, think about that they justify blasphemy in the name of whatever this pursuit of this inverted utopia is supposed to be. So, I mean, I said the Bible's next. I apologize. Apparently, they've already done it. Well,
you go back a little more recently. You and I think, did a story last year about how the Archbishop of Cambridge, the Archbishop of Canterbury, protected a minister, Episcopalian minister, who basically made the argument at a church service that Jesus was transgendered.
Yes.
That when Jesus was transfigured, that meant he was also transgendered. And I think you remember that story. But let me give you a
he also looked at, he took art. He took existing classic art and turned that art inside out. He inverted the art and used it to make his argument that Jesus was transgender, that Jesus was really a woman, a real woman, by the way. And this was a man from the pulpit doing this to a congregation of people who were horrified, to their credit, but Were they horrified enough to get up and walk out or say anything or do anything? Not much.
Do you remember he showed a picture of a medieval crucifixion with the wound under Christ's rib cage, and argued
Claimed it was a vagina.
It was a vagina, and it was leaking blood. This was a menstrual cycle, and this is exactly what he used the pulpit to talk about. Before we move a little further, let me give you a couple quotes from the story. The UK's Prevent program recently came under fire for treating actual Islamic terrorism as if it were simply mental illness. But when it came to far-right extremism, actual right-wing terrorism, of which there's almost none, they created a helpful guide to spot those dangerous right-wingers. It turns out that the people who are really the problem in England are people who read Beowulf and Chaucer and Shakespeare and Milton in 1984. Other books and films also that were written to promote Englishness or to read the great writers of Western culture, that now is a trigger, according to the UK government, for extremism and possible right-wing rebellion.
So when are they going to just simply say anybody who is not part of the woke faux Christianity in England is a potential domestic right-wing extremist? Because these are just stepping stones to saying if you're a Catholic who likes the Latin Mass, you're obviously a threat to the government.
So says the Pope.
Pretty much.
So says the Pope. Right?
So if you don't stand in line, if you don't walk that line, they're only, maybe a couple of months away from actually declaring people who actually believe in the real Bible, who actually believe in the Gospels, who live their lives by that, is declaring them, existential threats. By the way, 1984 is one of the scariest books you can ever read. You read that when you're in high school. And when you're done reading 1984, you're left with a sense that you never want to see anything like that happen. It is so emptying at the end of it. There's no hope. You're left literally hopeless. This is what the message was. Totalitarianism leaves a society without hope. It's just misery in perpetuity. And they're saying that if you read that and you understand that as a warning against totalitarianism, you're the problem. Meanwhile, you've got to wonder if the same people telling us not to read it are reading it as a roadmap, are reading it as a guidebook. And what should we do? How can we make people as dead and inhuman? This is the dehumanization of humanity. We could go on and on for hours about this. But there are people who look at that and say, hey, now that's a great idea. Maybe we should pursue some of these ideas. How can we do this without letting people know we're doing it?
This counter-terrorism organization in the UK also goes on to say this. They described how far-right extremists promoted reading lists on online bulletin boards. These books included that were recommended The Lord of the Rings by J.R. Tolkien, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, Conrad's The Secret Agent, 1984 by George Orwell, and the poems of G.K. Chesterton, of all things. You can't get more British than G.K. Chesterton. These are all now triggers, and it's not just books, it's movies. This list also called out movies including The Bridge Over the River Kwai, The Great Escape, and Zulu, The Bridge Over the River Kwai, which was all about how a plucky bunch of English POWs in a brutal Japanese concentration camp during World War II, how they managed to keep alive and to keep sane. And now because the English prisoners of war didn't get along and surrender to their Japanese captors, well, this is anti-Japanese propaganda.
Yeah, anti-Asian bigotry, of course. And perhaps it is as well a way to hide what concentration camps look like. I'm not sure if at the end of all of this, we don't have people who think that's a perfectly fine idea. There was an American academic, one of the very smart blue check people on Twitter, who was arguing early last week that we should get rid of the people who are useless eaters. We should get rid of people somehow. Maybe not through direct euthanizing, but put them in a place where they're no longer hamstringing the resources of society. Old folks, disabled people, people who are, who are in a utilitarian view, no longer contributing. I mean, you sort of think about this and you think, we're about the same age. Did you and I read the same things when we were in school? Did we actually process the same world that was going on when Ronald Reagan was president and we were assigned Beowulf by our English literature teacher and we were expected to pick up some of the other great books of American and British literature and digest the bigger meanings? Did you get the same message I did? You wonder where this comes from, Duke. People who grew up at the same time we did in the same culture we did, maybe the high point or maybe the beginning of the end, and come out the other side thinking, totalitarianism sounds like a perfectly nice thing. Let's just do it in a way that isn't quite as obvious. You work with people like this, so you tell me.
Well, as a Shakespeare professor, that's my major teaching responsibility. First of all, kids aren't taking it anymore. I mean, kids at the Gen Ed, they won't even take it. I mean, we're not teaching kids how to read. Do you think now with a generation who can have a sixth grade reading level, do you think that they're going to even pick up Shakespeare? So literally, it's not just the progressives at the top banning these books or warning about these books. It's not educating our children to be able to even read them.
Of course not. That's K-12. That is the dumbing down. And that's almost too cliche to say that. It is the utter deliberate invasion and destruction of K-12 public education for the purposes of turning children into easily manipulated, easily indoctrinated, good little soldiers for the progressive for the progressive future. That's where's our generation getting that? You had to seek out this sort of, subversive, neo-Marxist garbage. You had to seek out the destruction and inversion of logic. You had to go find that in some academic library somewhere. And here's a guy around our age who's spewing it like it's second nature to him.
Yeah, we also have still to come on this topic, Vicki. Roald Dahl, the great children's book writer, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Roald Dahl, his books now are being formally rewritten to become gender inclusive and no fat jokes. We're talking about that. So to illustrate what we've just been talking about, Vicki, this is unbelievable that a writer of the stature of Roald Dahl, who gave us some of these most wonderful kids' books, most famously, he gave us Willy Wonka, right? And so now after he's dead, he sold 250 million children's books. Kids grew up reading and learning how to read better from his books, and there he is, his picture is on the screen. Now, Puffin, in a division of Penguin Publishing, the editors have decided that there's too many fat kids, too much calling out of bad behavior in children, not nearly enough gender inclusivity in his books, and so they are quite literally rewriting this. A couple years ago, you recall, they did the same thing to Dr. Seuss. They just canceled 7 or 8 of his books because they didn't think they were progressive enough.
And Roald Dahl's books are being rewritten. They're being rewritten by, the Soviet censors. They're taking out words like the color black. They're taking out, references to fat mice. They are changing, the Oompa Loompas, which were, a group of men, a race of small men, small people. We can't have men identified explicitly. That in boys, the groups of boys are no longer groups of boys, they're groups of people. Any reference to being fat, chubby, whatever words were used, or stupid or insolent, all of that is being eliminated. And at least with regard to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, the Oompa Loompas were there to promote really common sense, easy for children to understand moral messages about gluttony, about rudeness, meanness, stupidity, insolence, all of that. And those were, you looked at that and you said, oh, geez, I don't want to be Augustus. I don't want to be Veruca Salt. I want to be Charlie. And all gone. We don't have any of those lessons. And, I don't want to, deeply analyze Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, but the moral lessons were kind of the whole point of the book.
Well, of course, Charlie's a little white kid. Listen to this.
We can't be white.
This is from a Fox News report. The publisher Puffin has altered these books, by hiring a sensitivity series of sensitivity readers, to make changes to certain portions of the author's words. So the publisher's rewrite altered numerous descriptions of certain characters' physical appearances, removed references to some characters being fat, and changed the language to gender neutral. Augustus Gloop, who you just mentioned, the chubby character featured in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, is now simply described as enormous, while Mrs. Twit, a character from the Twits, is described as beastly instead of ugly and beastly. And explain to me how enormous is going to make kids feel better than being called fat.
You're enormous. You're so enormous. Yeah, I don't think so. This is nonsense. This is about eventually rendering the lessons of that book irrelevant and meaningless, making that book not even worth picking up any longer. Happily, I was kind of surprised to see this, France pushed back against this and said they had no intention of doing anything to alter the language of those books.
Vicky,
I'm waiting for the United States, but amazingly, there's France going first.
I'd like to give a trigger warning, because to all our listeners, I'm warning you, we're about to show you a clip from the Oompa Loompas. Hide your children, run out of the house, watch at your own peril, Vicky.
What do you get when you guzzle down sweets?
Eating as much as an elephant eats.
What are you at? Getting terribly fat.
Yeah, there you go. Warning little kids not to become obese is now not just racist and not gender neutral because there aren't any female Oompa Loompa, right? Not only that, but now you're making fun of little people.
Well, Duke, I don't know what it says about me that every time that movie comes on television, I watch it over and over and over again. It probably means that I'm this close to domestic violence extremism or some such thing like that. It's meant to ruin all of the things that make being a kid, kind of fun. And it ruins the lesson, and it ruins the ability of children to grow up and be, better people. I remember the lessons when I was a kid. You remember the lessons when you were a kid. If you don't learn those lessons, and sometimes they came via a TV program or a really wonderful movie or a fantastic kids book, and your parents didn't even realize you'd learned the lesson. They just thought that somehow you were magically getting it by osmosis as, behaving like a good little boy or girl. I guess we don't want that. I'm not sure what we want. Do we want just zombies? I think so, because zombies are easier to control and you can always double tap them to get rid of them.
Well, you think about this. So it's perfectly necessary to put books about masturbation and pedophilia and transgender sexuality in front of 7-year-olds, but you can't have them read The Chocolate Factory anymore.
No, you don't want them to understand why they should not become obese. You absolutely want those young children to understand how to perform oral sex when they're 8 years old.
That's exactly right. And it's movies too, Vicky, and TV. Think about the Rings of Power, the completely woke rewrite of the Lord of the Rings, right? They took the mythology of Tolkien and the Silmarillion, and they turned it into a woke, completely feminist, unwatchable disaster.
So they take a classically and necessarily Christian writer whose entire body of work was put through the lens of Christianity and specifically as Catholicism, take all that out, and they wonder why their billion-dollar endeavor is not making money for them. Getting the eyeballs on it they thought it would.
I want to end with the cartoon that you sent me, editorial cartoon, right? There's the new version revised by an artist who's mocking this. Charlie, who identifies as Charlene, and the non-white candy of color sweatshop. There you go. News item: Puffin Books rewrites Roald Dahl classic to eliminate words that are deemed offensive. You can't mock this. I bet you the publishers are mad that they didn't rename the book that. Vicki, that's going to wrap this up. This is going to wrap us up for this week. Thank you for your presence today. It was a lively conversation. If you have any questions, comments, or you just want to support us at the show, simply visit drdukeshow.com. For all of us at the Dr. Duke Show, thanks, and we will see you again next time.